we dive into some pretty technical stuff sometimes, you know?
Yeah.
And today is no exception.
Mhm.
We're going to take a deep dive into process validation
Okay.
and the regulatory requirements around that in pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Sounds complicated.
Yeah, it is kind of.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. Making sure that the medicines that you and I and our families depend on
Yeah.
are made right,
Right. Yeah.
consistently and with high quality.
Absolutely.
That's something we all care about, right?
Yeah. For sure.
So that's what we're going to be looking at today. It's
Oh.
important stuff.
It is.
So that's our mission,
All right.
to sort of unpack what it means to validate how medicines are made,
Okay.
and then also how do these organizations come, the regulatory bodies,
Right.
ensure that these things are actually being done correctly
Mm-hmm.
and that each batch of medicine is made to the same quality standards.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to just take it for granted
Totally.
that when we go to the pharmacy and we pick up a prescription, we just assume that it's going to work exactly as intended every single time.
Of course.
But there's a lot that goes into that,
Oh, yeah.
you know, behind the scenes.
It's a huge amount of work.
So much science and oversight and
Right.
very meticulous.
Yeah. And so to get into this today, we've pulled from a bunch of different sources,
Okay.
looking at the way pharmaceuticals are developed and the guidelines that are out there,
Right.
and even some real world examples of,
Yeah.
from research and stuff like that,
Nice.
the OPR&D stuff.
Yeah, so we can really see how it's done in practice.
Exactly.
Not just the theory.
Yeah. And one of the things that really stands out from those sources
Yeah.
is just how detailed and careful this whole process is.
Uh-huh.
Because consistent manufacturing is crucial.
It's not just like a nice to have.
Right.
It's fundamental to drug safety and how well a medicine actually works for people.
Yeah. If it's not made the same way every time,
Yeah.
then you can't really be sure if it's going to work the same way every time.
You don't want unexpected consequences, do you?
Nope. Definitely not.
You've got to know it's going to do what it's supposed to do.
Right. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here.
Okay.
What exactly is process validation?
Right.
I mean, it seems obvious from the words,
Mhm.
but what does it actually look like in practice?
So when we talk about process validation in this context, we're talking about proof.
Okay.
Solid documented proof that the process you're using to make a drug is going to consistently produce a product that meets the standards that have been set,
Okay.
the quality standards.
So it's not just about getting it right once or twice in the lab.
No.
It's about showing that every single batch that comes out of the factory is going to be the same.
Exactly.
And it's going to meet those quality standards every time.
You're building quality into the process itself
Right.
from the ground up.
So you're not just hoping for the best.
No.
You're making sure that it's going to work.
Right. It's about having a system you can trust.
Right. And that it's going to work even if things change a little bit.
Yes, even with the normal variations that you might get in the manufacturing environment, like with raw materials or the environment itself.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Good.
So how do you actually do process validation then?
Right.
What are the steps to making sure that that consistency is there?
Well, it starts with defining the process really carefully.
Okay.
You need to understand every single step,
Mm-hmm.
all the different parameters that could affect the quality of the final product.
Like what kind of parameters are we talking about here?
Well, it could be things like the temperature of a reaction
Okay.
or the speed at which things are mixed together,
Uh-huh.
how long a particular process takes.
Okay.
All those things can have an impact.
So it's kind of like a map of the entire journey of the medicine.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it,
Okay.
from the very beginning to the final product.
And once you have that map, what happens next?
So once you've got that process mapped out, you need to create validation protocols.
Okay.
These are written procedures
Mm-hmm.
that describe exactly how you're going to carry out the validation process.
Okay, so it's like an instruction manual for proving that your manufacturing process actually works.
Yeah, you're basically laying out your argument
Right.
that the process will consistently produce a good product,
Okay.
and then you're explaining exactly how you're going to prove it.
Right. And I imagine you have to follow those protocols very carefully.
Absolutely, it's crucial.
Yeah.
And then documentation is key.
Yeah.
This is really important.
So we're talking about keeping records of everything.
Everything.
Okay.
Every single step, every test, every result,
Wow.
any deviations from the protocol,
Mm-hmm.
all of that has to be recorded in detail.
So it's like a paper trail.
It is a paper trail.
Okay.
And it's essential because it serves as evidence that the process has been properly validated.
So if it's not written down,
Right.
like it never happened.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so documentation is vital.
Vital.
And what about the equipment itself?
Right, so that's where performance qualification comes in.
Okay.
This is where you make sure that the equipment and the whole process are actually working as they should
Uh-huh.
under real-world conditions.
So you're basically running the process at full scale,
Yeah,
using the real materials.
using the actual materials and everything to
Oh.
confirm that it produces the right product.
So to recap, we've got defining the process,
Uh-huh.
creating the protocols,
Yes,
documenting everything,
absolutely.
and then testing it all under real-world conditions.
Yeah, you got it.
Wow, it's a lot.
It is a thorough process.
But it seems very thorough and systematic.
it has to be.
Right, because we're talking about people's health here.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the regulatory bodies.
Okay.
We touched on them earlier.
Yeah.
So the manufacturers do all this work,
Mm-hmm.
but who's making sure that they're doing it right?
Right.
Who's making sure they're following the standards?
Yeah, that's where the regulatory agencies come in.
Okay.
They oversee the whole pharmaceutical industry,
Hmm.
making sure that manufacturers are producing safe and effective medicines. They can inspect facilities, review documentation, and enforce the regulations.
So they're like independent auditors?
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
They come in and check that everyone's doing things properly.
Got it.
Our sources also talk about some of the legal frameworks involved here.
Okay.
For example, in the U.S., there's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act,
Okay.
and it defines what a device is.
Okay.
And that definition is really broad.
So it includes the equipment used in manufacturing.
Yeah, it includes lots of instruments and apparatus used in medicine.
Okay.
So even though it doesn't specifically talk about pharmaceutical manufacturing processes,
Right.
it shows you how regulated this environment is.
Because all those devices are being used in manufacturing.
Exactly.
It all ties together.
So it's not just about the medicine itself.
No.
It's about everything that goes into making it. The equipment, the processes, all of it. And how has the way we regulate this stuff changed over time?
Well, one of our sources mentions this document called Pharmaceutical Current Good Manufacturing Practices, CGMPs, for the 21st century, a risk-based approach.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is.
That's that about.
It talks about a shift towards a more flexible approach to regulation,
Okay.
especially when it comes to changes that manufacturers want to make after a drug has already been approved.
So instead of having a fixed set of rules for every change,
Right.
they're looking at the risks involved.
Exactly. They're taking a more nuanced approach.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And this is also discussed in the context of ICH-Q12,
Okay.
which is an international guideline for managing the life cycle of pharmaceutical products.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about encouraging improvement and innovation.
But without compromising on quality.
Exactly. You want to be able to adapt and improve,
Right.
but you can't ever sacrifice quality.
So it's finding that balance.
Okay, so let's go back to those validation protocols for a minute.
Okay.
We talked about them earlier.
Yeah.
But can you remind us why they're so important
For sure.
and what kind of detail they need to have?
So these protocols are like the foundation of the whole validation process.
Okay.
They're detailed plans that cover every aspect of the validation.
Give me an example.
Well, they'll include things like the objectives.
Okay.
What are you trying to achieve with this validation?
Mhm.
Then the procedures.
Right.
The step-by-step instructions for how to carry out the validation.
Okay.
The acceptance criteria. These are the specific results you need to get to show that the process is validated.
Right.
And finally, the responsibilities.
Okay.
Who's in charge of each part of the process?
So it's not just a general overview.
No.
It's super specific.
Very specific.
Got
And
it.
it all links back to the importance of documentation.
Right.
The protocol tells you exactly what records to keep. And those records become the proof that everything was done correctly.
And those records have to meet certain standards too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are regulatory guidelines that specify how those records need to be kept
Right.
and for how long.
So it's a very closed loop system.
It is.
Okay, so the protocol says what to do,
Mm-hmm.
and the documentation proves that it was done
Right.
and that the results were what you expected.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Good.
Now, I'm really interested in seeing how this works in the real world.
Me too.
You know, when you're actually scaling up production
Yeah.
from the lab to the factory.
Right. Because it's one thing to talk about the theory,
Totally.
but it's another thing to see how it's applied in practice.
Exactly. And luckily, our sources have some great examples of this,
You do.
especially from those OPR&D papers.
Okay.
So what kind of things did you find?
Well, one interesting example was about developing a process for making a key intermediate compound.
Okay.
that was used in a particular drug. And the researchers were really focused on getting a high yield of this intermediate.
So they wanted to make as much of it as possible.
Exactly. But they also wanted to avoid using expensive starting materials
Right.
or complicated purification methods.
Because those things can be difficult to scale up.
Yeah, they can be really tricky and expensive to do on a large scale.
So what do?
They optimized the process to use techniques that were easier to scale,
Okay.
like distillation or recrystallization, instead of things like chromatography, which can be harder to scale
So they were thinking about the practicalities of scaling up
right from the start.
right from the beginning.
Yeah, they knew that if a process couldn't be easily scaled up,
Right.
it wouldn't be practical for large-scale drug production.
Makes sense.
Another interesting case study was about a continuous flow process
Okay.
for synthesizing a different intermediate compound.
Uh-huh.
And in this case, they did a really detailed kinetic study.
Okay, so that's looking at the speed of the reaction.
Yeah, and what factors affect it.
Uh-huh.
And they used that information to develop a really robust and scalable process.
Okay.
And they paid a lot of attention to controlling the different parameters
Right.
to make sure that they got a consistent output.
Even as they increase the production volume.
Exactly.
So understanding the kinetics is key.
It's essential for maintaining control.
When you're working with larger quantities.
Absolutely.
What else did you find?
Well, there was another example where they were trying to optimize a process
Okay.
to increase the yield of a particular drug and also to eliminate certain byproducts.
So making the reaction cleaner.
Exactly.
Genetic.
And this made the whole process simpler,
Mm-hmm.
especially the purification steps.
Because fewer impurities meant less work to purify the product.
Exactly.
And that's really important when you're scaling up.
It is.
Because the more steps you have,
Right.
the more chances there are for things to go wrong.
Exactly. And you want to keep it as simple and consistent as possible. There was also one example that was a bit different.
Yeah.
It talked about a collaboration between IT companies and pharma companies.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were developing AI tools for healthcare.
Wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't directly about process validation,
Yeah.
but it shows how technology can play a role in this area.
Yeah. In analyzing all that data that gets generated during manufacturing.
Exactly.
And that can help to ensure consistency by identifying trends and potential problems.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how AI is being applied in this field.
It really is.
So these are just a few examples,
Mm-hmm.
but they show the kind of scientific rigor that's involved in scaling up these processes.
Yeah, it's not just about following a recipe.
No,
You need to understand the chemistry and the engineering.
absolutely.
And I imagine there are some challenges involved in scaling up.
Oh, definitely.
Like what kind of things?
Well, one common challenge is variability in raw materials.
Okay.
Even if you have strict quality control, there can still be differences between batches of starting materials.
And that can affect the process.
It can.
Okay. What else?
The performance of the equipment can also be an issue.
Yeah.
Something that works perfectly at a small scale
Right.
might not work the same way at a larger scale.
Okay. So you might need to re-engineer things.
Sometimes, yeah.
Wow.
And then, of course, you need to make sure that the process parameters are still effective,
Uh-huh.
even when you're working with much larger quantities.
So you need to be constantly monitoring and adjusting things
Exactly.
to maintain that consistency.
Absolutely.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much.
We have.
From what process validation is to how it's regulated
Yeah.
and even some real-world examples.
Right. And I think the key takeaway for our listeners is that this is really important stuff.
Absolutely.
Process validation is crucial for making sure that our medicines are safe and effective.
And it's not just a box to check.
Yeah.
It's a complex process with lots of steps and lots of oversight.
And it requires a deep understanding of the science involved. And those real-world examples we talked about,
Yeah,
they really highlight that.
they do.
So as a final thought,
Okay.
given everything we've learned today,
Mm-hmm.
what questions do you have about the journey your medications take?
Right.
From the lab to your medicine cabinet?
Yeah, it's amazing to think about all the work that goes into it.
It is, and it's all about ensuring the quality and consistency of the products you rely on.
So the next time you pick up a prescription,
Yeah.
take a moment to appreciate the complex process that made it possible.
And all the people who work hard to ensure its safety and effectiveness.
Absolutely.
It's a testament to science and human ingenuity.
It really is.
And it's something we should all be grateful for.
I agree.
So until next time, stay curious.
And stay informed.
See you later.
Bye.